She signed the papers like she was doing him a favor. The property was listed internally as Lot 7C, on the edge of a Hamilton industrial corridor that Marchetti Development had quietly been assembling for 18 months. To Sonia Marchetti, it was a rounding error, 140 square meters of crumbling brick and rotted framing that her acquisitions team had flagged as a tear-down liability. She had priced it at $1,500 to make it disappear from the books before the quarter closed. When the young man across the table counted out the cash in 20s and 50s, she watched him the way someone watches a child order from an adult menu, with patience, with the particular mild amusement of a person who has already decided the outcome. She did not shake his hand when she left. Ezra Boateng had learned not to expect handshakes. He was 22 years old, the son of a Ghanaian-Canadian carpenter who had worked the same stretch of Hamilton's lower city for 30 years before his knees gave out, and the grandson of a man who had built furniture in Accra that still stood in houses that had since passed through 3 generations of ownership. His father, Edmund Boateng, had not been a man of many words, but the words he did use he chose carefully. He used to say that a good craftsman never looks at what a thing is. He looks at what it can become. Ezra had heard that line so many times growing up that it had stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like breathing. The problem was that hearing advice and paying rent were 2 different things, and in the autumn of the year he turned 22, Ezra was failing at the second one. He had applied for 3 positions at furniture workshops in the city over the past 2 months. One had not called back. One had called back to say the position was filled, then posted the same listing 2 weeks later. The third had invited him for a working interview, watched him joint a drawer box by hand in under 4 minutes, and then told him they were looking for someone with more formal credentials. He had no formal credentials. What he had was 15 years of watching his father work, and a set of hand tools wrapped in canvas that Edmund had packed into a wooden box the month before he died. He had a rented room in a building on Barton Street that smelled like old radiators. He had $1,200 in a savings account and $900 in cash that he kept in a coffee tin on the windowsill because the tin had belonged to his father and he had not been able to throw it out. He had a contact named Yusuf. Yusuf Mensa was 30, a general contractor who worked renovation jobs across the lower city and who knew, through some invisible network of supply yards and city sifmits, about every property that moved quietly before it moved publicly. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, gone to the same church, and Yusuf had the particular gift of never looking surprised by anything. He called Ezra on a Tuesday evening in October. "There's a property on the Barton corridor," Yusuf said. "Old millwork shop, Marchetti, has it. They want it gone before end of quarter, $1,500. Ezra asked where exactly. Yusuf told him. The address sat 3 blocks from a stretch of road that Ezra had heard mentioned once, offhandedly at the edge of a different conversation. A city planner named Owen Birch, who attended the same community meeting Ezra had gone to the previous spring about neighborhood development, had said something about the Barton corridor. He had not said it to Ezra specifically. He had said it to the room, the way people say things in community meetings when they are not saying anything official. That there were plans, that the east end of the corridor was being looked at, that the city had infrastructure conversations underway that would take 2 or 3 years to move through the proper channels, but that the direction was clear to anyone paying attention. Ezra had been paying attention. "Don't," Yusuf said before Ezra had responded. "I haven't said anything. You're thinking it." "That's enough for me to tell you don't." Ezra told him he wanted to see it first. The building sat at the far end of a lot that was mostly gravel and fence. It was a single-story brick structure, maybe 800 square feet, with a loading bay on the east side and 2 narrow windows along the north wall so crusted with grime they were essentially opaque. The roof was flat and showed water staining along the parapet. The front door had been boarded at some point and then unboarded and was now simply unlocked, held shut by a padlock that was itself held in place by a hasp with 1 screw loose. Ezra worked the door open with his shoulder. The smell inside was sawdust and damp, and something underneath both of those, the particular smell of old wood that has been sealed in from weather for a long time. His eyes adjusted slowly. The space was full of equipment left behind when the previous tenant had cleared out. A table saw with a cracked fence, a band saw missing its blade. Along the back wall, stacked under moving blankets and old tarps, the shapes of things he could not yet identify. The proportions of the shapes told him they were large and flat. The dust on the tarps told him no one from Marchetti Development had lifted them. He walked the perimeter once. He stood in the center of the room for a long time without touching anything. Then he walked back out into the cold and called, "Yusuf." "I'm buying it." Yusuf made a sound that was not a word. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Sonia Marchetti did not attend herself. She sent her acquisitions manager, a man named Dale Coburn, who arrived in a company SUV and managed the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular type of transaction many times and considered it the least interesting part of his job. He was polite to Ezra in the way that people are polite when they have already decided the meeting is a formality. The contract had a clause. If Marchetti Development required the parcel for any phase of its corridor project within 24 months, the buyer would vacate with 60 days' notice and a fixed buyout at the original purchase price. Ezra read the contract fully. Dale Coburn checked his phone twice while he did. The clause was written to give Marchetti every advantage in every scenario, and the buyout number was low enough to make the clause functionally a threat. Ezra did not negotiate. He asked one question about the title transfer, confirmed there were no liens on the equipment left behind, and signed. He counted out the cash on the hood of Dale Coburn's SUV. Coburn took the money without comment, handed over the signed copy of the deed, and said something to the assistant beside him that Ezra did not quite catch but did not need to. Yusuf had parked down the block and watched from a distance. He walked over after the SUV pulled out. He looked at the building. He looked at Ezra. He looked at the empty coffee tin Ezra had brought the cash in, which Ezra was now holding by its handle. "You spent everything," Yusuf said. "Not everything. Close enough that the difference doesn't matter." Ezra put the tin under his arm. He said he was going to see what he had bought. Under the first tarp was a stack of figured maple boards, quarter-sawn, kiln-dried, each one between 6 and 9 feet long and at least 8 inches wide. The kind of stock that did not show up in ordinary lumber yards. The kind that furniture makers sourced from specialty mills and paid heavily for. He lifted the corner of the next tarp, cherry, then walnut, dark and dense and smelling of something almost sweet even under years of dust. Then another stack of maple, bird's eye this time, the surface of each board swirling with the small dark eyes that turned ordinary furniture into something people drove hours to see. He stood back, he counted. 7 stacks in total, covering perhaps 60 square feet of floor space. Conservative board footage calculation in his head came to something between 3,000 and 4,000 board feet of figured hardwood, much of its species and grades that had not been widely available from Canadian suppliers for 15 years. He sat down on the concrete floor with his back against the bandsaw and did not move for a long time. His father had a phrase for moments like this. Edmund Boateng would look up from whatever he was working on, wipe his hands on a cloth that had been gray so long it had forgotten any other color, and say it plainly. Some men see a tree. A craftsman sees every chair that tree was always going to become. The equipment needed work. The space needed heat. He had no money left for either. He opened the notebook he had carried since he was 16. A slim hardcover thing with cracked spine and pages dense with measurements and joinery sketches. His father had guided him through, and he started making a list. The first week was a lesson in what it cost to be cold and broke at the same time. He did not have enough money left to cover his room on Barton Street for another month, so he did not bother covering it. He moved into the building. He brought his sleeping bag, a camp stove, and the wooden toolbox Edmund had packed before he died. The building had no heat source. The flat roof creaked at night in the wind off the escarpment. He slept in his coat. He ate instant oatmeal and canned soup and rationed both. He drank coffee because coffee was cheap and because the act of making it in the morning on the camp stove was the closest thing he had to a routine, and routines, he had learned from his father, were what kept a man moving when nothing else did. The wood stayed where it was. He inventoried it properly this time, board by board, grading each piece, estimating yield for different furniture forms. He wrote everything in the notebook in the tight, systematic columns Edmund had taught him. It took 3 days working mostly by the light of a cord lamp. He had wired to an extension run from the single functional outlet near the bay door. Then he began the only work he could do without money. He cleaned and assessed every piece of equipment. The table saw was salvageable. The cracked fence could be replaced with a homemade one, which he built from a straight-edged piece of scrap maple and 2 clamps. The band saw needed a blade, which he could not afford. He cleaned it anyway. He disassembled both machines, cleaned the mechanisms, realigned the tables, oiled the bearings by hand. He got the table saw running on the second day with a blade he borrowed in exchange for 2 hours of work at a neighbor's shop 2 blocks over. He did not tell anyone he was sleeping in the building. Yusuf found out anyway. He came by on a Thursday evening with takeout containers from the Jamaican place on James Street and set them on the workbench without comment. He looked at the sleeping bag rolled up in the corner. He looked at the camp stove. He looked at Ezra's face, which had thinned in a way that was visible even in the low light. "You cannot keep doing this," Yusuf said. "I'm fine. You look like you haven't slept. I slept." Yusuf picked up one of the maple boards from the nearest stack and ran his thumb along the grain. He set it down carefully. "This is something," he said, almost to himself. "I know. It still doesn't make sense that you're living in a building with no heat in November. I know that too." Yusuf shook his head. He pulled up a stool and ate with Ezra without saying anything more about leaving. He came back 2 days later with more food and a space heater he said he had spare. He set the heater in the corner near the sleeping bag and did not ask to be thanked for it. Across town, in an office building on King Street West, Sonia Marchetti was not thinking about the millwork shop. She was thinking about a mixed-use tower she was assembling financing for in the North End and a residential conversion in Stony Creek that had gone over budget. The Barton Corridor parcel had been removed from the liability column when the transaction closed and had not appeared in her thoughts since. Her assistant, a composed and thorough woman named Bridget Lamb, mentioned it once during a status review. "The Barton lot sold," Bridget said. "The buyer is still occupying the building." Sonia looked up briefly. "Doing what?" "Not clear. Some kind of workshop, possibly." Sonia returned to the financing documents. The matter did not come up again. The first piece Ezra built was a bench. Not because a bench was the highest value thing he could make from the stock available, but because it was the piece he needed most. He built it from a wide cherry board that had a split in one end, making it unsuitable for anything that required full length. He cut the split out, re-squared the ends, and built a bench with breadboard ends and drawboard pegs, joinery his father had shown him at the age of 9 at a workbench in their basement on Cannon Street. He finished it in 2 days. He put it by the door and sat on it every morning with his coffee. The second piece was a hall table, figured maple, the bird's eye boards, narrow and long with tapered legs. He turned on a makeshift lathe he had rigged from the band, saw motor and a length of rod stock. He finished it in 4 days. He photographed it with his phone in the east window light on a morning when the sun came in at an angle that caught the bird's eye figure and made the surface look like something lit from inside. He posted the photograph to a woodworking forum he had been reading since he was 15. He wrote 4 lines, figured maple hall table, bird's eye stock, quarter saucin, hand-cut dovetails on the drawer, Hamilton, Ontario. A woman named Helen Ford messaged him within 12 hours. She did not ask much in the message. She asked whether he had documentation of the wood source and whether the table could be inspected before purchase. Ezra replied that he did not have provenance on the lumber beyond what he had found, but that she was welcome to inspect both the table and the stock it had come from. She replied that she would come the following week. Helen Ford arrived in a car driven by someone else, which was the first thing Ezra noticed. The second was the way she moved through the space, slowly, without performing interest, touching nothing until she had seen everything. She was perhaps 65, dressed in plain clothes with jewelry except a watch that looked like it had been on her wrist since before Ezra was born. She went around the hall table in a full circle. She opened the drawer and closed it and opened it again. She crouched down to look at the joinery on the underside of the apron. "Where did you learn to fit a drawer like that?" she asked. Ezra told her about his father. She listened the way certain people listen, without moving, without nodding on a schedule, with her eyes on him and her attention fully given. When he was done, she stood up and looked at the table again. "I've been buying Canadian studio furniture for 30 years, she said. "Most of what I see is competent. This is not competent. Competent is the wrong word for it." She wrote him a check for $3,800. After she left, Ezra held the check for a while. Then he put it in the notebook between the pages where his father had sketched a rocking chair they had never gotten around to building together. He sat on the cherry bench by the door and ate a full meal for the first time in 3 weeks. Yusuf appeared the next morning. He had heard about the sale through someone at a hardware supplier who had heard it from someone else, and the news had reached him before he had finished his first coffee of the day. He walked into the building, looked at the empty space where the hall table had been, and said nothing for a moment. He did not apologize for the things he had said about the purchase. Ezra had not expected him to. "Where do you want me to start?" Yusuf said. Ezra handed him a sanding block. Helen Ford did not keep the sale to herself. She made 2 phone calls the afternoon she got home, to people whose opinions about furniture she trusted in the way that people in that world trusted such things, slowly and based on long evidence. Within 3 weeks, Ezra had 2 inquiries from collectors in Toronto and 1 from a gallery in Montreal that represented Canadian studio makers. He used the money from the hall table to buy a proper blade for the bandsaw, fix the heat, and hire Yusuf for 2 days a week. He paid Yusuf properly from the start. He also did something he told no one about except Yusuf. He went to find Owen Birch, not to ask questions, not to confirm anything. Owen had not told him anything official, had not broken any rule, had only said what he said in a community room to a group of people who were mostly already looking at their phones. Ezra brought him a sealed envelope. Owen tried to refuse it. Ezra explained plainly that the money was not for information. It was for the fact that Owen had said something in a room, and Ezra had been paying attention, and that he believed paying attention ought to run in both directions. Owen took the envelope. Then, quietly and without discussing it with anyone, Ezra began looking at the properties immediately adjacent to his own. 2 narrow lots to the east, both of them cleared rubble, held by an absentee owner in Mississauga, who had not developed them in 12 years and who responded to Ezra's letter within a week with a price that was motivated by a desire to be rid of the carrying costs before winter. A third parcel on the corner, slightly larger, owned by a family who had been sitting on it since a project fell through in 2019, and who agreed on a number over a single phone call. He bought them at the prices people were willing to take before the city had said anything publicly. The furniture that came out of the shop in those months was the kind that Ezra would later find difficult to describe the making of. Not because the work was complicated, though it was, but because there is a kind of making that happens below the level of decision, where the hands and the material reach an agreement that the mind only understands afterward. He built a dining table from the walnut, 12 feet long, with breadboard ends and hand-cut mortise and tenon trestle base. The joints fitted to the 1,000th of an inch by feel and test and feel again. He built a set of chairs to match, with woven rush seats he learned from a YouTube tutorial at midnight, and practiced on scrap until the pattern came right. He built a cabinet from the remaining bird's-eye maple that had 42 hand-cut dovetails visible from the front, and a secret compartment behind the upper left drawer that served no practical purpose, and that he put there because his father had always believed that fine furniture should have at least one thing in it that nobody knew about. Word moved through the collector and gallery circuit in the specific way that word moved there. through chains of mention at dinner tables and studio visits, and forwarded emails with single lines of context. A furniture critic who wrote for a national design magazine visited unannounced one Thursday and spent 4 hours in the shop watching Ezra work. The piece that resulted was not long, but it was precise, and it used language that people in the field paid attention to. Then a man named Victor Strand walked through the door. Victor Strand was perhaps 55, with the unhurried posture of someone who had been the most significant person in every professional room he had entered for decades. He ran a brokerage operation that connected collectors and interior designers to independent studio makers, and he had built it on the assumption that no one working out of a corrugated-roofed building in Hamilton's East End would produce work that competed seriously with the established makers in his network. He walked through the shop the way people walk through spaces they have already decided about. He stopped at the walnut dining table, which was finished and waiting for delivery, and stood in front of it for a long time without expression. "You've got some nerve," he said finally. He said it in the tone of a man about to make a reasonable offer. He made one. He proposed to take all remaining inventory and all future commissions through his network, handling sales and client relationships on Ezra's behalf, in exchange for a percentage that Ezra understood immediately to be structured entirely in Strand's favor. The number he offered for the current inventory was roughly 40% below what Helen Ford had indicated the pieces were worth on the open market. Ezra looked at him steadily. "No, thank you," he said. Strand smiled. "Think about it. An arrangement like this doesn't stay available. I have thought about it." Strand looked around the shop once more. He looked at Yusuf sanding a chair leg in the corner. He looked at the young man standing in front of him in a work apron that had seen better years. "All right then," Strand said. "Best of luck." He left. The rumors started within 2 weeks. Ezra heard the first one from Helen Ford, who called him directly and told him plainly what was being said, that the Hamilton shop was using salvaged wood of uncertain provenance, that the joinery that looked hand-cut was machine-assisted and finished by hand to deceive, that the pieces were good but not exceptional, and that one serious collector had found dimensional inconsistencies in the hall table she had purchased. Helen Ford did not say Victor Strand's name. She did not need to. 2 scheduled appointments from Toronto collectors were canceled. A gallery inquiry that had been warm went quiet. The Montreal gallery asked for a third-party assessment of a cabinet they had already agreed in principle to carry. The cold edge of something deliberate had settled around the work. Then someone broke the east side window. Ezra found it on a Saturday morning, glass on the floor of the bay, a chunk of concrete block in the center of it. There was a piece of paper folded under the block with a rubber band. He unfolded it. 5 words in block letters. "Know your place. Move on." Yusuf was there. He read the note over Ezra's shoulder and went still in a way that Ezra had not seen before. Yusuf had grown up in Hamilton. He had read notes written in that register before, in other contexts, in other years, and he understood what the words beneath the words were. "I want to go see this man," Yusuf said. "No, Ezra, no." Ezra set the note down on the workbench. The notebook was there, open to a page where he had been sketching a rocking chair, the same design his father had sketched and never built. "We answer with the chair," he said. Yusuf looked at him. "The Ford Commission. The rocking chair Helen mentioned last month. We build it so well that nobody can say any of this about us again." Yusuf stood for a long moment. Then he picked up his broom and began sweeping the glass. The rocking chair took 6 weeks. Ezra built it from the best piece of walnut in the remaining stock, a wide, clear board with a grain so straight it looked milled by machine but wasn't. He cut every component by hand. The rockers were steam-bent over a form he built himself from scrap plywood and clamps. The back slats were tapered by hand plane, each one matching the next within a 1/4 millimeter. The seat was carved with a travisher he had made from a cabinet scraper and a curved handle turned on the lathe. He fitted the joints so precisely that no fastener was required anywhere in the chair. The whole structure held together by wood against wood in the way his father had taught him. Furniture could be held if the work was done right. He did not rush any of it. While he worked, Yusuf ran the shop, managing deliveries and responding to inquiries with a steadiness that had grown out of those early weeks in the cold building when both of them had been deciding whether this was something to believe in. The critical piece that changed the arc of everything was not the chair itself, though the chair was what made it possible. A journalist named Charlotte Webb wrote for several national publications and had built a reputation on stories about people who came from somewhere particular and refused to be defined by it. She had heard about Ezra at a furniture fair in Toronto through a collector who had seen the walnut table and could not stop talking about the drawer fit. She called Helen Ford. Helen Ford drove her to Hamilton. Charlotte spent 2 days at the shop. She watched and she asked questions, and she listened to the answers in the particular way she had of making people feel that the answer actually mattered to her, which it did. She looked at the notebook. She looked at Edmund Boateng's toolbox. She asked about the building, the wood, the contract with Marchetti Development, the clause. The piece ran in a national magazine 4 weeks later and was picked up by 2 others within the week. The headline read, "From Salvage to Studio. How a 22-year-old carpenter outsaw the developer who sold him someone else's treasure." It named Marchetti Development. It named the clause. It named the building and the wood and the hall table Helen Ford had bought and what she had said about it. It did not name Victor Strand, but anyone in the furniture world who read it understood whose rumors had just been made irrelevant. The canceled appointments uncanceled themselves. The Montreal Gallery reinstated its inquiry, apologized briefly in an email, and asked whether Ezra had additional pieces available for the spring show. He had 3. Helen Ford called the afternoon the piece ran to say she had already been contacted by 2 collectors asking for introductions. The rocking chair was entered into the Furniture Society's annual showcase in Toronto. The decision came to Ezra slowly, the way decisions come when you have been building towards something without letting yourself think about it directly. The showcase was the largest platform in the country for studio furniture, and putting the chair there meant either confirming what the article had said or exposing every limit of what he had done. Yusuf drove the truck. The morning before the showcase opened, Ezra walked the exhibition floor alone. He moved through rooms full of furniture that represented 50 years of Canadian studio making, pieces he had studied in books and online since he was old enough to search. He stood in front of the alcove where the rocking chair would be displayed and looked at the empty space. He thought about his father. Yusuf found him there later and stood beside him without speaking. "Whatever happens today," Yusuf said, "you didn't stop." Ezra didn't answer. He didn't need to. In the 3rd row of the public gallery that evening, Sonia Marchetti took her seat. She had come alone. She had not told her board. She had driven herself, which was unusual, and she had arrived early enough to find her own chair rather than be directed to one. She sat with her coat still on and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the room fill. She had read Charlotte Webb's article on the morning it published. She had read it twice. She had then asked Bridget Lamb to find out everything available about the building, the buyer, the wood, and the surrounding parcel acquisitions. The folder Bridget had assembled by the end of that day was thick. The parcels Ezra had bought adjacent to the original lot were, according to the preliminary assessments Bridget had found, now appraised at values significantly higher than what he had paid. The wood inventory, based on current market prices for figured hardwood of that grade, was worth more than the building itself had ever been worth. She had sat with the folder for a long time that evening and had not arrived at any feeling she could name cleanly. Her legal team had reviewed the contract at her request. They came back with nothing. The 24-month vacate clause was still technically in force, but the development phase that would have triggered it had been removed from Marchetti's corridor plan 6 months earlier when the financing structure changed. There was no path to the parcel that the contract would support. She had driven to Toronto without telling anyone why. The rocking chair was positioned in the alcove under a single directed light that made the walnut grain move. The people who passed it slowed down. The people who stopped stayed longer than they intended to. Ezra stood to the side of the display. his hands in the pockets of a plain jacket, watching the room rather than the chair. He found her without looking for her. Sonia Marchetti was in the third row, sitting straight, her coat still buttoned. She was watching the chair. Then, as Ezra noticed her, she was watching him. Her face was not what he had expected to find there. It was not the face she had worn in the acquisitions meeting. The mild offense, the efficient indifference, all of that was gone. What was on her face instead was something older and quieter, the look of a person who has had several months to examine something about themselves and has finally stopped postponing the examination. When the showcase formally closed and the room began to disperse, she stood. She crossed the floor without hurrying. She came to a stop a few feet in front of him and looked at him directly. "Mr. Boateng," she said. Ezra waited. "I sold you that property because I did not look at it. I looked at the price and the line item, and I did not look at what was inside it or at the person I was selling it to." She did not look away. "I was wrong about the property, and I was wrong about you. I came here because I wanted to say that somewhere other than a room I control." Ezra looked at her for a moment. Then he extended his hand. She took it. The handshake was brief. "You looked at what it cost," Ezra said. "I looked at what it was." Sonia Marchetti nodded once. She turned and walked back across the floor toward the exit. She did not look back. Yusuf had watched the whole exchange from across the room. He had not moved during it. When it was over and Ezra walked back toward him, Yusuf said nothing. He just looked at Ezra for a moment, then looked at the chair still sitting in the alcove under its directed light, and nodded once in a way that contained more than a nod usually holds. The Furniture Society gave the rocking chair its top award in the handcraft category. The citation used the phrase structural honesty 3 times, which was not a phrase Ezra had heard before, but which, when he read it, sounded like something his fathers might have said if Edmund Boateng had ever bothered with that kind of language. In the weeks that followed, the city of Hamilton published its formal infrastructure announcement for the Barton Corridor East extension. The plan had been on the Planning Commission's agenda for years, worked through channels at the pace that municipal planning worked through channels, and the announcement made it real in the way that official documents made things real. By the end of the month, the 2 lots Ezra had bought adjacent to the shop were appraised at more than double what he had paid. The corner parcel was appraised at triple. He did not give any interviews about the land. He gave one short interview about the furniture, declined a longer one, and went back to the shop. The building on the Barton Corridor did not look like the same place it had been in October. The original 800 square feet was still there, re-roofed and re-windowed, and painted a plain warm white with a small black sign above the bay door that said Boateng Studio in letters Yusuf had painted one afternoon when there was nothing more pressing to do. Adjacent to it, on the 2 eastern lots, a second building had been framed and sided, a clean workshop addition with proper dust collection, and a lumber storage bay with climate control to protect the remaining figured stock. Yusuf ran the floor. The title had come about the way practical titles always do, not through announcement, but through the gradual alignment of what was true with what was acknowledged. He had the steadiness of a man who had found something large enough to be useful to. There were 4 employees, all of them sourced from the surrounding neighborhood. 2 were trained woodworkers who had been laid off when a production shop downtown closed the previous spring. One's a young man Yusuf had met at a lumber yard, who had the specific quality of attention that both of them recognized on sight. The 4th was an apprentice, 17 years old, who had shown up at the shop door one morning with a portfolio of drawings he had made in school and asked, very directly, whether there was anything he could learn there. Ezra had let him in and put him to work the same day. He fed the apprentice lunch. He gave him his father's copy of a joinery reference book that Edmund had kept on the shelf above every workbench he had ever owned. At the end of the apprentice's first completed project, a small box in cherry with hand-cut dovetails that were not perfect but were not far from it, Ezra handed him a set of chisels from a maker in Sheffield that had been on order for 3 months. Helen Ford came by once a month. She did not buy any of the remaining walnut pieces herself. She said she had what she needed, but she stayed present in the particular way she had, forwarding names, writing the occasional note on heavy cream paper about something she had seen or heard that seemed relevant. She was the kind of patron who understood that what she was supporting was not an object but a practice, and that a practice needed witness as much as it needed money. Charlotte Webb published a second piece the following spring. She called it differently this time. The headline read, "The Apprentice Builds the Workshop." Victor Strand did not appear in the article. He had not appeared publicly in the studio furniture circuit since the showcase, the way certain people stop appearing when the position from which they operated disappears from under them, quietly and without formal acknowledgement. Sonia Marchetti, in her King Street West office, issued a new internal directive to her acquisitions team. It was 3 pages, written in plain language, without the dense subordinate clauses her usual documents favored. It stated that no commercial or industrial property would be sold without a physical walkthrough by a member of the acquisitions team and a written assessment of the interior contents filed alongside the financial summary, not a photograph review, not a contractor's exterior report. A walkthrough, a person in the building looking at what was inside. When her board asked for the reasoning, she said only that a recent transaction had reminded her that buildings contain things, and that the contents of a building are sometimes the more significant asset. She did not say Ezra's name. She did not need to. Everyone in the room had read the article. The last thing Ezra wrote in his father's notebook during that period was not a sketch or a measurement. He wrote it on a Thursday evening in February, sitting on the cherry bench he had built in the first cold week, with the new workshop humming on the other side of the wall and the original bay quiet around him. He wrote slowly, in the same tight letters Edmund Boateng had used for everything. They sold me a building full of what they could not see, but what I found inside it was not luck. It was the shape of every hour my father had already given me, sitting in the dark, waiting for someone willing to look. He read it once. He underlined the word look. Then he put the notebook in the drawer of the workbench where Edmund's toolbox lived, and he went home. There is something in this story worth sitting with, and it does not belong only to Ezra. Most of us have been handed an assessment at some point, a room where someone looked at us and made a quick calculation, a transaction where we were the line item, not the person, a door opened with the kind of ease that communicates clearly that it is expected to close again just as easily. It accumulates that kind of assessment. It comes in small transactions, and it finds the places where a person is already uncertain about themselves, and it confirms things that were never true in the first place. Most people learn, eventually, to agree with the assessment, not out loud, but in the daily choices that narrow the scope of what they try. What Ezra Boateng did was not refuse to hear the assessment. He heard it. He simply continued to look at what he knew was there, in the way his father had taught him to look, past the price and the condition and the first impression and the institutional disregard, all the way down to the grain. The people who underestimate you are telling you something specific. They are telling you exactly where they stopped paying attention. And where a person stops paying attention is always, always where the real material is. You already know what you can see that they cannot. The question is whether you are willing to do the work of lifting the tarp.